Let me start by placing on record my appreciation to Ram Madhav ji and his team at the India Foundation for the exemplary manner in which they have organized intellectual and cerebral activities during the last few years. I've had the privilege of participating in many of these events well before I returned to India on a long time and secure basis. And I can say that the work that Ram Madhav ji and his team have done have firmly placed India Foundation in any list of the more eminent think tanks, not only operating within India, but slowly and surely in terms of the think tanks operating outside India as well. This is a journey which is underway, and I'm sure that the churning of ideas that you undertook in the last 2 days will contribute to accelerating that process. Most of us perhaps underestimate the power of ideas. An idea is qualitatively different from knowledge or discovery. Great ideas give rise to beneficial social, economic, and political movements. Towards the end of the Second World War, many people gathered at San Francisco to sign the UN Charter. What was the central idea behind the establishment of the United Nations? To my mind, that central idea was to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And the fact that there has not been another major outbreak of hostilities on the scale of the Second World War could be regarded as a contribution of the United Nations. The cynics amongst us, including some of my disarmament friends sitting here, might argue otherwise, that the absence of another major conflict along the lines or on the scale of the Second World War was perhaps due to the fact that deterrence was provided by nuclear weapons. But whatever be the case, I think powerful ideas result in great institutions. They result in great and beneficial developments. In 2020, that is 2 years from now, we will be celebrating 70 years of the Constitution of India. And in 2022, we will be celebrating 75 years of our existence as an independent country. We are today the world's largest democracy and the fastest growing economy in the world. This in and of itself is not a small achievement. Before I go any further, I should tell you that any analysis of any situation based on a snapshot picture is both unrealistic and unfair to the phenomena and the developments that we are describing. The modern state, as we know it, is, in my understanding, a post-industrial revolution phenomena. The Industrial Revolution, I, as a student of history, along with my other friends, place roughly at 1750 to 1780. Many of our friends, especially the ones who are of the liberal and left-of-center persuasion, who get easily fascinated by what was described as the emergence of the Western liberal democratic order, think that democracy came to India thanks to the writings of the Western philosophers or liberal political thinkers. Nothing could be further from the truth. There is evidence that democracy in India existed as far back as 326 BC. Many parts of India were governed not by kings, but by republics. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, while studying Alexander the Great's attempt at invading India, found that most cities in the north and west of India had well-functioning democratic systems. If you accept my thesis that the modern state is a post-industrial revolution phenomena, then I would request you to take those dates back into India. The Cambridge historian Angus Maddison said that sometimes around that period, 1750 or so, India's contribution to the global GDP was 27%. After 190 years of colonial exploitation, and I choose my words carefully, this had dropped down to 3% of the global GDP. In other words, the downward spiral over a period of 190 years, even the 70 years of our existence as an independent country, we have not been able to correct it. And I believe we will need to correct that. One of my senior colleagues in the government, the finance minister who was addressing you yesterday, addressed this theme from another angle. And I believe the National Security Advisor who was speaking at a public function reiterated the need for 10 years of stable, strong government in order to overcome the developmental challenge that we face. I want to add to those two contributions with a small suggestion from my side. When we became an independent country in 1947, after a period of 190 years when decision-making had effectively been taken away from those who cared for the country, and we were thrust in a typical colonial mode, state capacity at that point of time was weak. State capacity even today is not adequate. And there are many reasons for that. Today, we are a $2.7 trillion economy. We are growing well at a rapid rate, 7% plus, but our per capita incomes are low. Even when we become a $5 trillion economy by the year 2025, and our per capita income doubles, even then, the state's capacity to provide the essential requirements for existence will be enhanced but not adequate. It is only when we become a $10 trillion economy by 2030 that I believe the state will have the resources in the normal course in order to be able to provide amenities to its growing citizenry at a level which could be called satisfactory by global standards. What does this mean in practice? What this means in practice is that even 70 years after existence as an independent country, we had, prior to May 2014, when the Modi government was elected, several 100 million of our citizens still without individual household toilets and public toilets and community toilets. Therefore, speaking from the ramparts of the Red Fort on August 15th, 2014, the Prime Minister said that it was his dream that by the time we celebrate the 150th birth anniversary of the Mahatma on 2nd October 2019, India should be 100% open defecation free and should have 100% solid scientific waste management. We are well on the way to achieving that. He also announced in June 2015 that by the year 2022, every Indian should have a home which he or she can call their own. Again, we did an analysis of how many homes that would be required to be built, and we came to the conclusion it is somewhere in the vicinity of 11 million. The good news here is that as of last month, we had already sanctioned 6.2 million. We do monthly reviews every month, and last month we sanctioned 628,000 in one go. These flagship missions require resources. Swachh Bharat, Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, Amrut, a scheme whereby we provide water tap connections and sewage treatment facilities to 500 of our cities and the 100 smart cities. How do you provide the resources if your own citizens do not pay taxes? Again, if you look at the discourse coming from the liberal left of center friends that I have, they will criticize without understanding the complexity of the situation. Let me give you an example. Demonetization and GST. You don't have to be a tax lawyer to look at the figures which are staring in the face. Yes, the money which was demonetized came back, but we at least know where it came from. And once you know where it came from, whether it is in the name of the person who actually owns that wealth or it's Benami, somebody else has put it forward, it gives your taxman an opportunity to go and locate the source. The number of tax assessees, the number of returns filed, the figure is staring you in the face. And I'm making a simple proposition before you. If you have a population of 1.25 billion plus, you're a $2.7 trillion economy, and if income tax is what the previous Prime Minister, you tell me, in India it's voluntary. If you want to file a return, you can file and give your bank account. If you don't feel like filing a return, it's all right till you're discovered. Apparently on the night that demonetization took place, somebody was relating this story to me this morning. Somebody turned up at a particular point and says, I have got 17 crores in cash. He was asked the question, how did you do it? He said, no, I've been running my business for years. He said, how did you manage to do that? He said, well, all the transactions were in cash. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the change. If you want to prepare for a country that will be a $10 trillion economy, that will give each of its citizens world-class amenities, homes which are green and resilient, a good healthcare system, a top-of-the-line education system, then your citizens have to be partners and stakeholders in the creation of a kind of state capacity. Now this discourse which comes from my friends on the liberal left-wing center, I mean, some of them are my closest friends, they view the state in the same intellectual terms with the same coordinates that the state was viewed in Western political philosophy. One of the things I learned to my horror when I was appointed ambassador and permanent representative of India to the United Nations in Geneva, and I was the representative to the Human Rights Council or Commission then, was that whenever I spoke in terms of India being a victim of terrorism and how terror is used as an instrument of policy by certain players in the international system, I found initially an amount of bewilderment. Why? Because the mental conditioning of those people is that the state is an all-powerful entity and the individual is at the receiving end and the individual is a helpless creature and therefore the state is the one which commits human rights violations. From my point of view, this is true to that lineage, to that linear progenitor of that thinking, that the state is the one which is always wrong. Has anybody bothered to analyze what we have done to the state after 190 years of colonialism and 70 years of a flawed narrative? So you can, as my friend and senior colleague Arunji pointed out yesterday, I mean, social activism can be a camouflage for taking a pot shot at the state. We argued, and successfully, in international fora, and I think that discourse is beginning to change, including in the West. I used to tell my hosts when I was accredited to the Court of St. James in London, I said, your democratic freedoms are being misused by those who say that this is about human rights. And they know what happened. 9/11, successive problems there. The state must have the capacity. Why do I keep coming back to state capacity? For a very simple reason. In a country as diverse and as rich in terms of cultural heritage, who will deliver the goods and services which a growing population requires? I may be saying something for which I will be trolled later, but I don't think organized religion has ever had the capacity in India to deliver those goods and services. And if you have on top of that a situation where organized religion, to the extent that I understand what organized religion is pilloried at every stage, and you are made to feel persecuted as a member of a majority religion, I don't see how you'll organize yourself. And if organized religion fails, who takes over? It is the con man who takes over. By the con man, I mean all the deras which come into being, all the babas, etc. To me, the biggest insurance against a massive con job at the society and at the level of delivery of goods and services is to have state capacity where the state, as a secular state, can deliver basic goods and services. And I think there is no option to that. The thinking behind this, let me also go back, is not new. In fact, those who contributed to that evolving idea of India, Mahatma Gandhi, Vinoba Bhave, Deen Dayal Upadhyay, saw this to come. But they saw it in the 40s and 50s. In fact, when the United Nations General Assembly adopted the 2030 Agenda or the Sustainable Development Goals in September 2015, those Sustainable Development Goals actually echo the work done by the Mahatma Vinoba Bhave, who had sought Sarvodaya through Antyodaya, or leaving no one behind. And that, to me, is the new idea of India which is developing, and that is an idea which the Prime Minister talks about in terms of the new India by 2022. By the time the UN completes its work on the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, India will have 600 million of our citizens living in urban spaces. In 1947, the number of people living in urban spaces in India was 17%. That was 17% on a population base of something like 300 plus 350 million or so. The latest census we have is the 2011 census, which showed the number of Indians living in urban spaces at 30%. But that 30% was already on a population base of 1.25 billion. A previous government in 1975 tried to do away with the chapter on civil liberties. And they decided, in the interest of efficiency and modern urban management, that they would pick people up from the slums and try and locate them 100 kilometers away. That idea did not work then, and that idea will not work now. That idea will not work ever, because the democratic quotient in our society is so high that it is central to that democracy that any Indian can live in any city he or she wants. Now, with the contribution of agriculture to the GDP coming down, it's about 12 or 14% now. Is it any surprise that people will pick up their bag and baggage and move to urban areas? Therefore, we have no option but to provide decent ease of living to the people moving in from the rural areas to the urban areas, and that is where the good news starts, and that's where the good developments are taking place. In the last 1 year or so, we have, in the heart of Delhi, we have relocated 2,800 families in a place called Katputli Colony. We have relocated them temporarily away, and by March 2019, we will bring these 2,800 families into new homes in green and resilient buildings. Earlier, the place had filth and squalor. The distance between the water pipe and the sewage pipe was almost non-existent. And we're doing this in other parts of the country. We've done it in the heart of Bengaluru, where a slum in the center of the city has been converted into a green and resilient building which houses 8,600 central government employees. We're doing this elsewhere as well. When I was a new minister, I used to take great pride in talking about the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana. And I used to say, I'm going to get this target completed well before 2022. And I used to say, every month we sanction between 300 and 500,000 homes. I once called my officials and asked them, listen, you guys, I hope you're not egging me on and we don't have a situation. And I was told, no, you may actually be erring on the side of caution. And that was proved right when last month we signed 628,000. Now let me tell you a little bit about a home. It is very fundamental. It is also very transformative. My previous generation came in as refugees. My father lived in a refugee camp till his family was allocated a small refugee rehabilitation property, which Shakti is aware of as well as I am. And the fact is, once you have a little home and you can send your children to school, and education does the rest. But if you don't have a home over your head and you have to go on living in shelters with all kinds of problems, or you are literally on the road, you have a problem. Now, the government is not the only one which is building homes. There are other people in the private sector. But if you look at why the government scheme of Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana will succeed, and that is what I talk about state capacity, for 3 reasons. One is the number of beneficiaries who want those homes is a given. As I said, we did a study. It came out to 11 million. These are people who gave their names that they would want a home. An earlier figure put it at 18 million, but then we did a validation with the states and the union territories. It was 11 million. Number 2, in 6 out of the 8 options that I have outlined, the government provides the land. And anybody familiar with the task of buying a home realizes that 40 to 60% of the value of the apartment is the land value. Now, government is providing the land. And number 3, in addition to having an identified scientific list of beneficiaries providing land, the government also provides subsidies. And I take you through these 3 or 4 vectors very quickly, verticals very quickly. Under the credit-linked subsidy scheme, if somebody wants a home, a young professional, like you youngsters sitting here, and you go to a bank for a loan, the bank typically says 12% interest or 14% interest. You can come to the state, to an identified entity, and they will give you an interest subvention under the economically weaker section of 4%, under the LIG for 4%, and under the MIG, middle income group, of 3%. In other words, if the loan costs you 12% and you fall under the EWS section, you will get 4% as a subsidy from us, the government, upfront, and 3% for the MIG. Now tell me, you have land being given by the state in a scheme, you have an interest subvention on property you buy elsewhere, and you've got in situ slum rehabilitation taking place. You've got an affordable housing and partnership vertical under which, if you are a family which, let's say, qualifies under the EWS, an apartment typically built using government land costs 6 or 7 lakhs. The central government will give you 1.5 lakhs, the state government will give you 1.5 lakhs, and you raise the remaining 1 or 2. I've seen those apartments in Surat. Believe me, what was given to the beneficiaries at 6 or 7 lakhs, the market value is something like 30 lakhs. Beautifully built, totally green, resilient. Now, once you get to the point of 2030, in any case, you will have a quadrupling of per capita income. These things will not become necessary. Market forces can take over. But even market forces will not take over a situation of the kind that you inherited after 190 years of colonial rule, because the inequality is so high. And what happens, some people will otherwise become richer, others will become, will have more difficulty. That's why I said the thinking of the Mahatma, Vinoba Bhaveji and all the others of Sarvodaya through Antyodaya, or leaving no one behind. That is the idea, I think, of the new India. And that is the idea the United Nations adopted in September 2015 when they adopted the 2030 agenda. But that's an idea which has been around in India for a long time. I'm not going to take up more time. I have a written speech which I have not used. We'll put that on the website. But let me conclude by a few observations. One, I think there was an exchange between my senior colleague, the National Security Advisor, and Shekhar Gupta on whether it is necessary to have a national government elected with a thumping majority as against a coalition. Look, coalition governments also take bold and far-reaching decisions. I remember when in May '98, what was the slogan? The Buddha is smiling. When we conducted our nuclear tests, the Buddha is smiling, yeah. Smiling Buddha. I know, looking at Shakti, I'm reminded of. The fact of the matter is you need an extraordinarily clear-headed and strong leader. If you have a majority on top of that, it helps. And I think full marks to the point of time when we had the Vajpayeeji's government, and I'm saying this with a certain emotional touch because, we're all mourn the loss of this very tall leader. But that's a tradition which the present Prime Minister is continuing. That when it comes to issues which are of fundamental and basic importance to the country, don't waffle. Don't waffle. Take that decision. And I think that is what will distinguish India in the years to come. On the way there, you will have a lot of criticism. You will have people telling you, one worthy Prime Minister called demonetization organized loot. I don't know where he was getting his facts from. I mean, the same man told me that in India, income tax is voluntary. If you feel like you can pay. I mean, you can say it because you did not exercise political power. There was a diarchy. There were a group of people around Mrs. Sonia Gandhi who was a more effective group of decision makers. It arose because the Prime Minister of India was an appointee. He was an appointee, and by the time he was appointed, the rules of the Congress party, parliamentary party, were changed. So it was not the elected member of parliament who became Prime Minister, it was the other way around. Now, if you tell me, and the criticism is coming from those people, if you tell me that you can run an effective decision-making apparatus for a large country with the kind of problems we have, then I rest my case. But I think, as facts are beginning to show, you need a sense of commitment, you need a sense of passion, and you must have the ability to take those tough decisions. So, with due respect to my friend Shekhar, whom I thought he was here because he was speaking in a previous session, but when I get him alone, I will tell him, yes, sometimes coalition governments can also take good decisions. People who don't have an absolute majority by themselves can take important decisions. But wait a minute. To go on to prescribe that you would then, and that's not Shekhar Gupta, that's the other guys, to go on prescribe that, no matter what happens, it must not be BJP, any motley crowd can come together. Look at the people who are coming together, whose entire lives were based on opposition to that one family Congress rule. They now want to join hands, and so I find it, Second point I wish to make to you is that we are slowly heading into a new kind of territory, where the source of criticism coming from a small part of Delhi, which we are familiar with, which has the name of a particular gentleman, although my friends who are educated in town planning and architecture tell me that actually the name is inappropriate even for that part of Delhi, Lutyens Delhi, or they call it Lutean, I don't know. I don't know which the... Look, the discourse in 2019 and elsewhere will be determined by how many gas connections you give, how many shauchalaya you build, how many Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, Ayushman Bharat. That is what aspirational India is looking for. The discourse in 2019 and in the 10 years to come, when we go to 2030, will depend on how those 115 aspirational districts, which we have, and I'm very proud to have adopted one of them, how those will be transformed. That's the real story. The story is not some fictitious thing you do about some aeroplane whose name you cannot pronounce. I keep telling them, it's Rafale, it's not Rafael. Rafael is a Latin American name. If you have connections with Latin America, otherwise, then that's a different thing. So I now come to a final submission to you. And again, I come back to Ram Madhavji, Chandar Vadhva, all the other dignitaries, Shakti and Mr. Doval, who was here till recently. Look, after 190 years, the British left India. We're not exactly sure, as students of history, as to why they left. They didn't leave India because that elitist group of lawyers around Annie Besant formed something called the Indian National Congress. To my mind, as a student of history, if I were a betting man, I would say that the main reason was this gentleman whom the South Africans remind me, you sent to us an English-educated lawyer, University College London, called to the bar in a temple, and you sent him to South Africa, we converted him into a Mahatma and sent him back. I think that fusion he produced between those elitist lawyers and the people, the masses of India, through those social mobilization, through the non-violence, that is what determined the shape of India's national movement. And I must say, there must have been some contribution from those Indian soldiers, Indian troops, working for the British war effort in 1914 onwards. But when it came to the Second World War, those people were beginning to revolt. So the idea of India germinated across those spectrums. But there's a problem. When the British elite left India, they left behind an identical mindset thinking Indian elite, which had been, how do I put it, which had been, I wouldn't say subverted. Subverted is too strong a term, but which had been strongly conditioned by that thinking of Western liberal, there's characters called Mr. Macaulay, who came along, who in 1835 produced a minute on English education. But I want to conclude with just one thought. This period that we are talking about here, how much of India's civilizational history does it represent? I would ask you to take a guess. My own view is that if you think Indian history is, 7,000 or 8,000 years old, then this period represents only 1% of our civilizational history. And I think we're getting caught up with all the wrong time phases. India is much greater. We had democracy much before British colonialism came. India is far more resilient, and India will assert itself. I think we're already asserting ourselves, but by the time you're a $5 trillion economy, those people who were preaching to you on a large number of issues, which reached their height sometime around 1992, when this gentleman, what's his name, Francis Fukuyama, wrote the book, The End of History, because he said the Western liberal democratic order has arrived. This is the end of ideology. Communism has taken a beating, and The mainstream narrative is globalization, human rights, and a whole lot of, and Washington consensus. You know, only a few days ago, I read a review that Mr. Fukuyama is now saying that maybe socialism needs to come back or is coming back. I always say, let's be modest in our characterizations as students of history, but I think I can afford to be very, very optimistic and upbeat when it comes to the idea of India and the idea of India which is unfolding thanks to the dynamic leadership of the Prime Minister. Thank you very much.